Good afternoon. Welcome to CEC Gurukul live lecture. In fact, today is the second part of our series of lectures on the topic called Feminist Perspective in Political Theory. In fact, in the first part, we had looked at this issue that how this feminism as a discourse in social science in general, in political science and political theory in particular, has over the years set a new agenda for theorization, conceptualization, in political theory, and how this has happened. And I also mentioned in my last lecture that this is one theme which has come to the discourse in social science and in political theory, through movement. It is not that the thinkers and the theorists have themselves brought this issue on their agenda. Rather, a very vibrant, powerful movement in the society has basically brought this issue to their attention and to their discourse. So therefore, there is a clear-cut relationship between the movement, the politics, the activity, the action on the part of the women activists, the feminists in society, and its impact on the entire agenda of political theory and political science. So this is something important to remember, that how social activism, social activity, social churning has led to this new discourse in political theory. Now, of course, we also looked at some of the issues which I would like to recapitulate before I move further in my discussion today, that we also saw that how this entire neglect of gender difference by the mainstream political theorists was responsible for this new churning, which is normally called feminist theory. And those feminist thinkers and theorists who have been working on this theme, they have highlighted, they have pointed out the neglect, the kind of neglect this issue, the gender issue, suffered in the hands of the classical thinkers as well as the modern political thinkers, and therefore this neglect was responsible for this entire new consciousness, new churning in society. For example, they cite the example of Aristotle's exclusion of women from political activity, which is well known, and also the Rousseau's argument for women to be educated differently from men. So these two examples, one from the modern, another from the classical Greek political tradition, can tell us that how this issue was neglected for long. Even Nietzsche's claim, a Nietzsche thinker, who is basically considered to be offering a contrarian position on number of issues, and which has influenced number of discourses in modern time, including postmodernism and post-structuralism, which have interrogated the mainstream discourse in social science and political philosophy. Even Nietzsche's claim that the equal rights for women are evidence of a society in decline. These examples are cited by the feminist thinkers and scholars to highlight this issue, that how this issue was neglected for long. And so therefore, the main issue which has been troubling them is that why and how this entire history of political theory and political philosophy has been the history of male domination and history of male theorists, and women's contributions have been systematically marginalized, ignored and neglected. For example, they say that even the canonical feminists who are today are inspiring whole host of feminist scholars like Mary Wollstonecraft, Bell Hooks, Simon de Beauvoir, Andrew Dworkin, Kate Millett, etc. were not taught for long in political theory, political philosophy and social science, and their contributions were not taken seriously. In fact, even John Stuart Mill, which is considered to be a mainstream political thinker, so far his contributions on liberty, on representative government, on representation, on democracy, number of issues are concerned, but even John Stuart Mill, John J.S. Mill's writing, particularly dealing with the women's question, that famous tract called Subjection of Women, which argued for women's suffrage 50 years before this entire demand for suffrage was conceded to women in the West. John Stuart Mill's this writing, that is Subjection of Women, was not taught, was not discussed and was not taken seriously. So these are the examples, and even in contemporary time, even recent times, particularly the high priest of liberalism in 70s and 80s, John Rawls' theory of justice is alleged by the feminist scholars to be gender blind, because when he talks of the principle of justice in original position, he essentially talks of heads of the household, and it is well known that who heads the household, that basically the male member of society. So therefore what happens that in hands of John Rawls, justice within the family is not addressed at all. So therefore they say that this tradition is continuing even today within the liberal tradition, particularly Rawls' writing particular theory of justice is best example. So therefore this birth of women's movement brought back the gender issues in social science as a whole and political theory in a big way. Today of course no one can deny that there is a very vibrant feminist perspective in political theory, and political theory's curriculum, the syllabi everywhere has important component on feminism and feminist theory. So this is how one can see that how feminist perspective has made its way within the discipline of political science and political theory. Of course there are different ways, different perspectives among feminism and feminist thinkers. We will be looking at those perspectives, particularly as and when this movement has evolved. For example, it has moved through number of waves, and therefore normally the three waves are identified: the first wave, the second wave, and third wave. The first wave, the initial phase of this entire women's movement, which is basically was influenced by the liberal discourse of rights, equality, justice, and therefore it is normally called the discourse of sameness. They wanted same treatment between men and women. And then of course the radical feminist came, and that is characterized by the second wave, where they didn't demand same treatment, but they rather demanded different treatment, arguing that biologically men and women are different, so therefore that biological difference should be taken into account, and accordingly some special rights should be granted to the women. So therefore it has moved through phases and waves, and we will be looking at those waves as well in course of our discussion. But one thing we should remember here, that some feminists are totally rubbish, or one can say dismiss the ideas and contributions of male philosopher, and they say that then only the women's issues can be highlighted. Though this line is not shared by all feminists today, and many of them said that no, we should take into account those contributions which are important, or which gives important clue for women liberation or emancipation. So these issues are also there, as feminism as a theory, feminism as a discourse is not very homogeneous. There are multiple trends, traditions, theoretical inspirations, and also many contestations. So therefore what happens that for some feminists the concepts and assumptions of mainstream political philosophers need to be totally overturned, and we should start from this, we should begin from the scratch, and it should be replaced with the theories that take gender difference into account from the very start, not something which should be considered as an add-on, that which will be added in course of the discussion or theorization. So on the other hand, there are other perspectives as well. So in fact these are some of the issues we should keep in mind, and we have had discussion in the first part of our lecture also. Now what is feminism? We discussed in our last lecture that there are many varieties of feminism: the liberal feminism, which is associated with liberalism; socialist feminism, which is essentially inspired by the ideas of Karl Marx. I had mentioned his friend and collaborator Engel's writing Family, Private Property and State, that how it has influenced whole host of socialist thinkers, theorists, particularly in understanding this gender issue, the kind of exploitation and discrimination which starts from the family settings, and how the institution of property is an important tool, important mechanism through which this operation happens, and the first site of this operation is family. So therefore this Engel's piece, Family, Private Property and State, has been a very influential piece of writing so far as socialist feminism is concerned. But then socialist feminism has also gone beyond this Marxist tradition, because socialism itself is not a very homogeneous discourse. There are multiple strands within it. So therefore liberal feminism is one, socialist feminism is another. Then of course in 1970s and 80s we could see the another type of churning which is normally referred as radical feminism, and we will be looking at this radical feminism in some detail today also. And in fact, it started interrogating both the liberal and the socialist feminism. And interestingly, this birth of the radical feminism is associated with the second wave of feminist movement, whereas the liberal feminism and the socialist feminism are put under category of the first wave. And then of course in 90s and in 21st century we have seen altogether different type of discourse emerging, where you have entire churning or entire quest for intersectionality, this perspective where gender is not seen in isolation, but gender's interrelationship with a number of other identities in society like race, class, ethnicity, nationalism, religion. So therefore this intersectionality is basically the key word so far as this perspective is concerned. But intersectionality and perspective related to intersectionality is not the only perspective, but we have also seen some sort of fragmentation happening with black feminism, psychoanalytic feminism, ecofeminism, postmodern feminism, difference feminism, and in India we also hear about Dalit feminism. Recently Akash Singh Rathore has come with a book called Dalit Feminism. So what we find that this entire discourse of 90s and 2000 and particularly in 21st century is a reminder that how this entire feminist theory is still in process of evolution, and in fact there is no final word on this, and the new issues are coming, new ways of theorizing this issue are also emerging. But one thing we should remember, that there are few theses on which in spite of these differences and contestation we have seen, they share some ground. For example, I had mentioned earlier also in my last lecture that entrenchment of gender is a very important dimension which basically unites all of them. Similarly, the second issue which unites them is the existence of patriarchy, that there is no denying the fact that there is a male domination all around in society, starting with family, and then that spreads to different institutional network and institutional matrix. For example, they argue that gender is not a neutral in effect, but casts women as inferior. Patriarchy means rule of the father, and this patriarchy is maintained through opaque and informal structures such as social norms. The entire process of socialization within family, through which values are inculcated among young people, among children, there in fact is the first beginning of this patriarchal ideas and patriarchal discourse, when male and female child are basically taught differently about social norms, customs, the values and their behavior. So therefore this existence of patriarchy, in fact in society there is no dispute among these feminist schools of thought, in spite of differences on number of themes and issues which we will be looking at in course of our discussion. And then of course the need for change is another unifying factor so far as these feminist schools of thought are concerned, because all of them have a common quest for reforms and change. In fact, internal debate among them on the method, manner and nature of change may be different, but nonetheless all of them agree on this issue, that there is a need for change. And therefore in fact the two important different two schools which have emerged in recent years around this issue of the change, the nature and direction of change, is normally seen in terms of a debate from two different perspectives. One is called essentialist perspective, another is called anti-essentialist perspective. The essentialist perspective essentializes the identity of women in society. Biological identity is essentialized, whereas the anti-essentialist perspective in fact does not subscribe to that position. So therefore what happens, that these two different perspectives, essentialist and anti-essentialist perspectives, lead to two different discourses. One is the discourse of identity, another is the discourse of difference. In fact so therefore this essentialist tries to essentialize this identity of woman, whereas the anti-essentialists try to overturn it. So these are some of the internal debates among the feminists, but nonetheless one thing we should remember, that the need for change is not something which brings any difference of opinion among these feminist thinkers. But before I move to the core ideas of this feminist thought or feminist theory, we should look at the relationship between political theory and feminism. Because one thing we should remember, that when we talk of feminist perspective in political theory, what is basically at the back of our mind, that political theory works with certain conceptual tools and conceptual premises, be it the notion of state, sovereignty, power, the entire discourse on number of values, be it freedom, equality, liberty, equality, justice, diversity, tolerance, and so on and so forth. So what happens, that this entire feminist theory and its advent, or one can say that its appearance on the intellectual horizon, has interrogated all these premises, and thereby has basically put this entire political theory community on defensive, and as a result of which today we find that political theorists are engaging with some of the issues which the feminist theory as well as the women's movement have problematized and have brought on the agenda. For example, when feminist theory first engaged with political theory, they started critiquing the liberal universalism and the idea of unencumbered self, that self is totally unencumbered, it is not loaded with any other type of identity, or one can say has no social connection. But what has happened, that over the years, when they started taking a position that self is of course a situated self, situated in society, and therefore this entire idea of unencumbered self is a very fallacious argument to offer. And of course, not only feminists, but some of the other schools of thought within liberalism in recent decades and years, like multiculturalism, communitarianism, they have also problematized this issue of unencumbered self when they basically started talking of individual rights and the group rights. But the feminism shares some common ground with these churnings in political theory, be it multiculturalism or communitarianism, so far as their criticism of this unencumbered self within liberal tradition is concerned. So therefore, what has happened, that these feminist theorists first engagement with political theory started when they started taking a position, or they started arguing that equality and liberty, the two important buzzword of liberal discourse or liberal theory, has not materialized for women. Why is it that in spite of so much churning, so much theorization, so much reflection on these issues, why women still are not enjoying the fruits of equality and liberty in society? And therefore, in fact, this was the first posture which basically made the political theory community to wake up from their slumber, because the feminist thinkers and the feminist theorists started arguing that women's equality required change in law and society, and therefore the kind of discourse with which the liberal theory was working would not be enough to basically to translate this entire idea of equality and freedom for women. For some of the feminist theory of some feminist thinkers, in fact this entire equality, or one can say that bringing equality and freedom in society by changing law and social structure would not be enough, because they basically argue that for acquiring that type of status, equal status as a citizen for women, we need to completely change the conceptual resources available within the discipline of political theory, and only with the new conceptual resources we can take a full account of the difference between men and women. So therefore, this entire difference perspective was a very powerful posture to entire political theory in 20th century, because earlier the entire posture was in terms of equality discourse. The liberal tradition, it worked and operated within the liberal tradition so far as equality and freedom are concerned, that why the equality and liberty are not reaching to the women folks in society. But later on, when the new discourse started among feminist thinkers and theorists, they said that this sameness argument, that men and women are same and therefore they need same treatment, would not be enough to uplift the woman to emancipate women, to give freedom to them, unless we have the new conceptual resources, and those resources have to see women as different from men. Then only perhaps the fruits of these values or these ideas could reach out to them. So therefore this was a very important thing. But another important dimension was the imagining the entire public and private sphere differently by the feminist theorists, and this was a very powerful assault on the earlier tradition in political theory, the way entire idea of public sphere was theorized, and the way entire private sphere was ignored, neglected, and relegated to the background. So this public private distinction was a very important distinction in political philosophy and political theory, and feminists made a frontal attack on this distinction, because they said that women's oppression and exploitation essentially starts in the private realm, in the private sphere, not in the public sphere, and when it starts in private sphere, it finds its way in the public sphere as well, and thereby what we find that entire oppression, exploitation, marginalization and deprivation first start in family settings, and then it travel to the public sphere, be it the state institutions or the civil society. So therefore this distinction between public and private was a very powerful distinction within political theory, and the feminist scholars, thinkers try to break down this by saying that family and the personal life are of crucial relevance so far as the justice discourse is concerned, and if liberal theory is seriously concerned with the justice, then it has to take the private as seriously as it is taking the public. So therefore this was another very important issue which was highlighted by the feminist theory. Then of course women's access to employment and men's contribution to domestic work and caring responsibility, how these things require a new thinking, was also a very important moment so far as the feminist theories engagement with political theories engagement with the women's question was concerned. Of course in fact when the feminists started arguing that male violence poses barrier to the justice, and there are many sites of such violence in society, and political theory has to take into account those sites where the power dynamics can be seen, where the power operations happen, then of course it was another very important posture to political theory. And then most recently we have seen another important churning among feminist thinkers and theorists, and that has also led to a new type of engagement between political theory and feminist theory, that is ethics of care. In fact the family is the first important site of ethics of care, but apart from family there are many other sites, be it a care for the infirm or the nursing sector and so on and so forth, and normally it is seen that the women are associated with the ethics of care, but ethics of care suggests that justice itself may be insufficient. The feminist argument goes like this, that ethics of care is a fact of life, be it family or outside family, and ethics of care suggests that justice itself may not be the sufficient for understanding justice for the woman. Gender should not be added on to political theories after they have already been developed. Rather, it needs to be considered from the very beginning. We will have more discussion on this ethics of care, which is a very important posture to political theory, as well as that has led to some internal debate among the feminist scholars, because ethics of care many feminists are not comfortable with. They feel that it is something reducing the role of women to care sector and not giving them their due place in other sectors like male. But and therefore this is something which is regressive step so far as women's movement is concerned. But some of the feminist scholars have argued that taking ethics of care does not mean that women will be reduced to this sector and their role in other sectors will not be taken into account. But if we are really concerned with women's rights, women's identity and women's emancipation, but some of the sectors or some of the areas or spheres in society where women can perform or have been performing significantly, and that domain particularly can be associated with their biological makeup. Particularly the kind of requirements these sectors demand, for example emotions and other things, we should not ignore it and we should not basically stigmatize it. So this is something, a very important debate in recent years. We will have more discussion on this ethics of care later in course of our discussion. Now this feminist theory, therefore this engagement between political theory and feminist theory has led to rethinking on some of the core issues in political science and political theory, and those issues which have witnessed this rethinking is, number one, the nature of power. This entire discourse of power, because political theory's engagement with power is very important and also well known. Be it the state power, the entire discourse of sovereignty, various multiple institutions in society, power is a very important object of study so far as political theory is concerned, and we have had discussion on this when we are discussing what is politics. Now what has happened, that this feminist theory has brought new ideas, new perspectives on this nature of power, that how this power operates. And here, in fact, in recent years, under the influence of postmodernism and the Foucauldian discourse, what has happened, that the feminist theory has theorized and problematized this issue in a big way, and they believe there are different sides of power operation. It is not only a state which can be the central lever of power in society. There are multiple sides, multiple levers of power, and they have to be seen in interconnections, particularly from the point of view of women's rights and women's operation. Then number two is the boundaries of the political, because how do we conceptualize the idea of political? We have had discussion when we were discussing the idea of political and what is political theory, what is politics. In fact, this idea of political itself has been undergoing transformation over the years and over the decades. And today what has happened, that the entire boundaries of political have broken down completely, and feminist theory has contributed significantly in breaking this boundary so far as the political is concerned, because earlier the political was seen only through the prism of a state and state institutions. Political was theorized and understood only from the point of view of public sphere. But what has happened, that after the advent of feminist theory, no longer the political can be understood simply in terms of the public sphere, but the private is also important component of this idea of political, has been now realized by political theorists across the board. And therefore what we find, that this entire boundaries of political have been broken, and largely on account of this powerful movement that is called women's movement in society. And the third is the democratization of citizenship and public sphere, because citizenship is another very important issue for political theory, and how this idea of democratization of citizenship, because citizenship, Marshall's theory is well known so far as citizenship is concerned, when he talks of evolution of this entire idea of citizenship through phases. When earlier it was the civil and political rights, then it of course became later a different type of discourse when the class aspect of citizenship came, and this is how Marshall discusses this evolution of citizenship ideas in modern time through revolutions and through movements. But these feminist thinkers and feminist theorists have subjected to Marshall's theory to rigorous criticism, because they believe that this evolution thesis of Marshall completely ignores women's rights and women's presence in society so far as this evolution of this this citizenship is concerned. Because when Marshall was dealing with the citizenship, he didn't consider that how that the entire discourse of civil and political rights, when he talked of the first phase of this evolution of citizenship discourse, excluded women, because women were not given those rights, civil and political rights, only it was available for male members of society. It was later, only after this movement started, that women could get even the political right to vote, after the suffrage movement started in the West. And therefore interestingly, when entire West was claiming to be a democratic society, in 20th century only the rights to vote to women were granted. So, therefore, this democratization of citizenship in terms of equality of rights and other similar entitlements is another important issue which has been problematized, highlighted and theorized by the feminist theorists so far as the political theory is concerned. And then of course, this entire question of nature of a state and state power is a very important aspect so far as the feminist theory and its engagement with political theory is concerned, because nature of a state is always seen in terms of its role in regulating the public and the private, because earlier in the liberal tradition a state was only seen as an institution existing in the public sphere, but the private was never addressed. The question arising from the private sphere was never addressed. But what has happened that the feminist theory has subjected to this perspective to a rigorous criticism. They said that a state regulates the private sphere as significantly as public sphere. For example, they cite the example of marriage rules, the divorce, inheritance. These are the rules and these are the laws which are framed by the state, and most of these laws pertain to the family life, the private sphere, and therefore a state intervention can be seen in clearer terms here, that how a state's role is important to regulate the private life of the people. But what happens that when we discuss the nature of a state, we do not take into account these aspects, these dimensions of the private in analyzing the nature of a state. So therefore that tells us, shows the gender blindness of the political theory when it comes to the nature of the state. So therefore interestingly what we have seen also along with this, that a very powerful return of a discourse on a state in political theory from the point of view of feminist theory, because one thing is important here to remember, that state on the whole has been relegated to the background, particularly due to certain new trends and new processes unleashed in 20th century, late 20th century, particularly aftermath of this globalization and also due to the transnational processes. But nonetheless, so far as feminist theory is concerned, state has made a comeback. Rather, there is a they have brought it back, the state discussion into entire discourse, largely on account of this realization that one cannot ignore the state, because the state regulates private sphere in a big way, and if private is political, that is the slogan coined by the feminists, particularly in the second wave of feminist movement, particularly when radical feminism emerged and gave this slogan that personal is political, then say that we have to always keep the state and its role in sight. So therefore these are some of the issues through which we can see that the feminist theory engages with political theory in a big way, and some of the new conceptual issues and problems they have brought to the attention to political science and political theory community, and political theory today is seized of all these issues so far as the theorization is concerned. Now next issue is the feminist method. What is the feminist method? Because no theory can claim to be something different without having some speciality or some specific features in terms of its method. So what is the feminist method? And here in fact 2-3 issues we should remember, that these methods in fact differentiate the feminist theory from other theories. In fact the most important one can say the signpost of the feminist method is the standpoint epistemology, that which is basically today associated with them and considered to be one of their biggest contribution. But then there are few more things, and we should keep those things in mind. So when we talk of feminist method, in fact the feminist movement or the feminist theory believes in gathering of evidence, criticizing and developing philosophical arguments and political activism. So this is how they want to proceed. They simply don't want to build theories in abstraction. They rather try to build argument on basis of hard evidences. So therefore gathering of evidence is important, then subjecting to existing theories, subjecting existing theories to criticism on basis of the evidences gathered, and then developing a philosophical arguments, and then taking to political activism. So this is how they basically structure their entire discourse. But two methods pioneered by them need a special mention here. The first is interrogating politics, policies and programs, particularly from the woman's standpoint. And here I am reminded of Catherine Bartlett, who called woman question, this method as a woman question, that whenever they interrogate politics, whenever they interrogate policies, whenever they interrogate programs, they always see that how the woman question comes into that issue, how that influences or affects the woman's question, and accordingly in fact they proceed. They always ask that how existing laws and theories affect once the particular position of women is taken into account, how they are based on male norms and perception, and how they are going to disadvantage the woman. So therefore these one can say the entry points in the argument or in theorization, or one can say these vantage points completely differentiate this entire feminist method from other methods in political theory and social science. For example, they say that gender neutral employment practices disadvantage women, because for a long period of time it was employment was considered to be gender neutral, be it wages or hiring or any other similar method. But they say that it can't be gender neutral, and therefore in fact this gender neutral employment practices for a long period of time disadvantaged women, be it the kind of right of leisure, or one can say the kind of leave which they were entitled to were not earlier considered. Only later, after this powerful movement started raising this issue, that today we have different countries have a provision for maternity leave, child care leave and many other leaves. So what has happened, that this has come to the woman only through sensitization, or one can say problematization of this issue, that gender neutral employment always disadvantages women, and therefore this issue cannot be seen from gender blind perspective. It has to be seen in terms of the biological differences from men and women, that how women rears child, and therefore they deserve some different type of treatment so far as employment is concerned. The second method is the consciousness raising, and this is something which is considered to be the contribution of second wave feminism, which started in 70s, which gave that powerful slogan that personal is political. Now this consciousness raising method includes the talk about the experience of various stakeholders or participants or subjects in this process, and through discussion attempt is made to develop more critical understanding of experience of different members of society, the women folks in society, and therefore on basis of those experiences a new perspective on social structure could emerge. So therefore in fact this entire thing of taking the experience and richness of experiences of various women activists, the subjects, the agents in society is a very important aspect of this method. This is also sometimes referred as experiential epistemology, that entire theory of knowledge is built through multiple experiences, and how those experiences bring new ideas, a new value system, new perspectives, and accordingly the theorization is done. So therefore what you find in political theory, that two issues have been raised by them. One is the politics of theory, another is the ethics of theory, that who should theorize for women. In fact, can the male members theorize for women without experiencing the kind of situation in which women are placed, and therefore is it not desirable that the experiences, the richness of those experiences of women should be accorded due regard and due importance, in theorization, where they can bring in their own experiences, and on basis of those experiences some new perspectives, new ideas can emerge, which will not be possible if the theory is built by those who have not experienced similar situation. So therefore this is a standpoint this is experiential epistemology along with this standpoint epistemology, and both have a number of commonalities, because when a standpoint epistemology is talked about, we essentially talk about the experiences of women and how women talk about this entire thing from their standpoint, from their experience. So therefore this experiential epistemology and a standpoint epistemology are important aspect of this method. So therefore the two methods we have already mentioned, we have seen here coming from this feminist theory. One is of course this entire focus on experience and consciousness raising, and the first was of course interrogating politics, particularly on the point of politics, policies, programs, everything from the point of view of women's question, and seeing everything that how it is going to affect the women in society. So these are two important features of the feminist method. Now coming to these waves, which I mentioned earlier also, that how the feminist discourse has moved through waves, and normally three waves are identified, but sometimes now the scholars have been talking about the fourth wave also, particularly the contemporary phase, when this the post feminism is talked about, when intersectionality is talked about, they say that we are in midst of the fourth phase. But the three phase, of course there is a consensus that feminist discourse has moved through three phases. The first phase, the first wave, in fact three waves are rather referred. The first wave of feminism is normally associated with the liberal feminism, particularly under the influence of liberal theory, liberal discourse or liberalism. Feminist activists, feminist scholars, feminist theorists got sensitized about the value of equality and freedom and justice, and then they started raising this issue that why male and female are treated differently in society, and accordingly a very powerful movement for suffrage rights started, which is now normally called as suffrage movement. The suffragettes were raising this issue that why women are denied this right to vote, why this political equality is not coming to them, why they are not treated politically equal to male members of society. So therefore this suffrage first wave feminism was associated essentially with this suffrage movement, and also the quest for equal treatment, the quest for rights, quest for liberty, quest for justice through law, reforms and constitution. Broadly within the legal framework, they wanted equal treatment with male members of society. So therefore this first wave feminists like Sylvia, Emanuel, Christabel Pankhurst, Mary Wollstonecraft, John Stuart Mill, these are some of the names which are normally referred so far as the first wave feminism is concerned, because they highlighted these issues, be it the John Stuart Mill's famous a piece of writing, Subjection of Women, or Wollstonecraft another a famous piece called Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792 in the backdrop of French Revolution, where he she highlighted that how French Revolution was basically talking only about rights of men, and that those rights were not extended to women. So therefore this first wave of feminism is normally associated with sameness argument, that men and women are equal, they deserve equal treatment, they deserve equal rights, and there should not be differentiation in treatment, and law and policies need reform. There has to be a new legal protocol in society where their equality should be considered. So therefore this is what we call the first wave feminism, which is also referred as liberal feminism, which was basically the first phase of the evolution of this entire discourse. Then we come to the second phase of the feminist movement, and this second phase is referred as radical feminism, and it started in 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s. and there are many names which are basically referred in context of second wave feminism. Schulmith, Firestone, Andrew Dworkin, Germaine Greer, Mary Daly, and for example Kate Millett's book Sexual Politics in 1970, Greer's book Female Eunuch 1970. These are important landmarks in terms of this entire new churning within feminist theory, which is called a radical feminism of 60s and 70s. Now, in what way this radical feminism differed from the first wave of feminism, which is the liberal feminism, is also important to remember. The second wave feminism focused on personal, psychological, sexual aspects of female operation, whereas the first wave of feminism was focusing only on the political and the political and social and economic rights and economic aspects of the woman. In second phase, what happens that not only political liberation was highlighted, but also women's liberation. That political liberation by per se would not lead to women's liberation, and for liberating women, for emancipating women, we have to do something more, we have to do something extra. It cannot be taken for granted that if there is a political liberation, by that count women will also be liberated. And it is in this context when they coined this slogan that personal is political, it was a very important moment in the evolution of the feminist thought, when, as I mentioned earlier, that entire private was brought within the purview of political. The boundaries of political were redefined, reimagined and broken. And it is here that this radical feminism, which is also associated with the second wave feminism, has played important role. Of course, that has led to many interrogation, that has led to many contestation in recent years, and many people have questioned their position, where they feel that this difference perspective which they highlighted has also completely ignored, or one can say the marred some other insights which came from the first phase. We will have more discussion later on this issue. But the key theme of the second phase of feminism, second wave of feminism, was attack on male violence, sexual violence, rejection of feminine norms such as sexual submissiveness, and participation in beauty practices like beauty contest and other thing, critiques of enforced female domesticity, insistence on female solidarity, etc., etc. And therefore, when they talked, they started talking about difference, that men and women are different biologically, and therefore that difference should be honored, and on basis of that difference women deserve some special rights. What we find that a new perspective was emerging. But of course, by 90s, in fact we feel that there is a third wave emerging so far as the feminism is concerned, and three processes are to be seen in 90s. One is post feminism, that is a process of de-radicalization, retreat from the uncompromising position of 70s which we associated the second wave. And this idea of post feminism argues that the goals have been achieved, and therefore we should look beyond feminism, rather we should talk in terms of universal emancipation. Then of course we also see that they started talking that women must see themselves as agents, not victims of of process, and therefore the focus on violence unnecessarily undermines women's agencyhood. Then the sexuality is also liberating. It should not be only seen in negative and pejorative terms, and therefore all consensual sexes should not be should be condemned. Then feminism also should focus on women's material equality rather than symbolic aspect of gender, which was basically the highlight, or one can say the salient feature of the second wave feminism. And then femininity, including participation in beauty practices and gender dress, is compatible with equality. There is nothing so demeaning about this femininity which was highlighted by the second wave feminism. Natasha Walter's book The New Feminism in 1988 is a key post feminist text. So, therefore, post feminism argues that goals have been achieved and now we have to look beyond feminism. But then also fragmentation happened with post modernism, psychoanalytic feminism, black trans feminism, black feminism, ecofeminism, Dalit feminism, and we will have more discussion on this in our next lecture, including the core ideas and different schools of thought, and also we will subject them to some criticism.